Good morning and welcome to Creative Teaching. Thank you so much for being here. It's Friday, May 29th of 2020. I've been sick, so my breath is shallow. Good morning and welcome to Creative Teaching. I always have to do it. Thank you so much for being here. It's Friday, May 29th. So I want to open by situating this conversation in some cultural and historical context, because these episodes are streamed live on YouTube, but then they live online in the archive, and so they can be viewed by folks in the future. And so for anyone watching this in the future, Friday, May 29th, 2020, we are still in a global pandemic. And also on Monday, George Floyd was murdered by police in Minneapolis. And that came on the heels of Christian Cooper having the police falsely called on him by a white woman in Central Park. And that was on the heels of 500 years of racialized violence and state-sanctioned white supremacist terror. And there's so much more that can be said about that, but that's very alive in this conversation and in this moment, and always in the American conversation. So I offer that as some context for the conversation today between myself. My name is Laurel Butler. I'm the host of Creative Teaching, and my pronouns are she and her. And I am broadcasting from Tongva land, also known as Los Angeles, California. I'm a Capricorn, Leo rising, Aquarius moon for folks for whom that has meaning. And I am so humbled and grateful and looking forward to having this conversation, this really important conversation with someone who is an incredibly dear friend and person in my life, and who recently has been facilitating a space that I've been participating in called Listen In, which is a white working group looking at pedagogies of embodiment as a way into self-reflexive, anti-racist praxis and engagement. She's also a dancer and a choreographer and the founding co-facilitator of Practice Progress, which is the consultancy that is facilitating the Listen In groups. And she is the artistic director of Ground Series Dance Collective, as well as so many other things that we will touch on today in our talk. So I want to welcome Sarah Ashkin, dear colleague from behind the digital curtain. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today on Creative Teaching. Hi.
Hi, Laurel. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today.
Yeah, man, tuning in. It's a big part of the work. Do you wanna start with like name, pronoun, where you're broadcasting from, land acknowledgement wise, and like maybe anything astrological that feels pertinent to share?
Yes, I can totally share that. So my name is Sarah Ashkin, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm Zoom tubing, YouTubing, Facebook living you today from Coast Miwok land, through my family's mobility and a history of settler colonialism. I am here in Coast Miwok territory, also known as Sausalito, California. I'm a Pisces, and to me that just means that I connect with and welcome an identification with water, and fluidity, and with connectivity. And that's all. Yeah.
Thank you. Beautiful. I, as someone who has known you for some years, I affirm that that is true. Speaking of which, last week I was on here with dear Ron Reagan, and we talked about relationship as being really fundamental to the work that we are all a part of, and sort of like tracing those relationships as a way into the autobiographical, to give a sense of who you are and who we are, you know, in relation to one another. And I feel like I don't want to spend too much time on that, because I feel like we don't necessarily want to center ourselves fully in this conversation. But geography feels really present for me, thinking about, you are from New Mexico, like deeply from New Mexico, and I am married to someone from New Mexico, went to grad school in New Mexico. All my in-laws live in New Mexico. So that's there. We both went to college on the East Coast. We both lived in the Bay Area during like the early 2000 teens, and we're very much a part of this queer DIY dance performance making scene. And then at a certain point, we both moved to Los Angeles and got jobs teaching, and got set up on a blind date, one of the, like maybe the best friend blind date I've ever been set up on, by Brittany Delaney, who I hope is watching, who's also part of Ground Series. Yeah, and the rest is sort of friend history, but that's only, you know, where I can sort of identify. Are there gaps that you want to fill in as far as your journey of how you arrived here on this talk show on this day?
We all are continually journeying. But I think on the creative teaching talk show with my dear one, Laurel, I arrived here, I think, through the power of my teachers. I'll just name a few of them. Eiko and Coma, Pedro Alejandro, Anna Halprin, Jaule Willa Zolar, Colin Poole, Simon Ellis. You know, that this like big, and this was part of your conversation with Ron, but I will just say that like, it's because I've been facilitated into, Prof. U, Gina Ulysse, I've been facilitated into growth and healing and challenge. And I just recognize it makes me like a little trembly with gratitude, because I recognize how much labor has been invested in me to do my work. And I just want to do, I feel honored and deep responsibility to do right by them. And so in particular, I would say that, you know, when I encountered racism in the classroom as a young person, as a student, I was able to have one sort of understanding of that as right. And then when I became a teacher, and not only was I witnessing, you know, my colleagues and starting to understand how I, as a teacher, was replicating the ways in which whiteness as an ideal in the classroom gets replicated. And then one of my high school students was killed by the cops when I was like 2015-ish. And that was kind of it for me. I was like, well, if the dance classroom isn't a place where we make space to talk about histories and present day practices of violence, and make this place where, like, for me, arts education is so amazingly powerful and special, because literally we get to do what we want in there. Right. We're not taking the test. Yeah. We're not like, you know what? So for me, it's like, okay, great. Here's a space where, and I'm so lucky that I got to experience some of this, where healing can be prioritized, where like self-expression and understanding what that means as like a tool for like self-realization, and also for like tearing apart the world and putting it back together in real time. Like art does all this powerful healing. And so when my student Victor was killed and there wasn't enough space in the world that I was in to hold that, both pedagogically, curricularly, because, you know, we had to get back to dance training. I was like, you know what, like dance spaces have to be a place where if they say that they prioritize the body, then we really have to like do that. We really have to prioritize the body. So then I went to grad school in London, and I started writing and learning and doing a scholarly and performance practice really deep into this question of how has dance education become a site of white supremacist practice. And so now I think where I'm at, and as a teacher and a facilitator and a choreographer and a writer, is trying to honor like all of those experiences by getting really clear about like, who am I? What is my racial identity? What is the meaning of my racial identity in this place at the front of this classroom? And like, how can I leverage that for justice, for Victor, you know, like, so that's where I'm at now.
Yeah. Thank you. And rest in power, Victor.
Yeah.
Something that you have opened up a space for me recently to really engage with and contemplate is this idea of accountability to without performativity, right? The idea that you are still accountable to the teachers that you named, and that we are accountable to Black authors and intellectuals and thinkers and activists whose work we are reading, and that we are accountable to Black, Indigenous, POC loved ones. And that is a motivator for our actions, just because accountability is a fundamental kind of ethical and spiritual imperative. And so I'm just grateful for you naming your teachers at the outset, because I think that creates a container of accountability that we can operate within. And I think that the idea of containers and holding space, I talked a lot with, we're going to reference the conversation with Ron a lot today, obviously, but we talked last time about teaching and facilitation and the way in which like those have semantic differences. And there's a Venn diagram, right? There's like an overlap there. But the idea of facilitation as holding space, I think, is so important, you know, for so many reasons, not the least of which is that the world is so fucking unwieldy, right? And that the project of working to dismantle white supremacy and build another world that is possible is so like sort of massive, that holding space helps us be able to apprehend like one way into the work. And I think that is also the power of arts education, where you were like, arts education is so cool because we're not bound by these strictures, right? I remember, really quick anecdote. I remember when I was a little baby artist activist at Hampshire College, and I was starting to get really rapidly politicized about prison abolition because of one of my teachers, Amy Dowling, who I want to name, who's in the Performing Arts and Social Justice program at USF. I was at the Reproductive Rights Conference, and Vanessa from Critical Resistance was speaking. And she was like, look, you can't go to the warden of a prison and say, hey, I want to teach a radical abolition curriculum in your facility. He's not going to go for it. Tell him. And I was a theater major. We didn't really have majors, but I was like studying theater at the time. And she was like, tell them you're doing a theater workshop. Say that. Then you can get in there and hold the space for individual transformation and also this kind of like systemic analysis and deconstruction and et cetera, et cetera. And my brain was just like, bing, you know, it's like there's the curriculum and the hidden curriculum, which I think, I don't know, brings me to sort of the big question that I want to ask everybody who comes on this show, which is, fundamentally, my question is, what is good teaching? Right? That's like the perpetual inquiry. That's like the essential question. But I think in this case, I'm also thinking about facilitation. You know, like you and I have both been classroom teachers where our primary objective is like transmitting information. But I'm thinking about, in our last call with Ron, he talked about facilitation as helping people meet information. And I like stopped the show. I was like, I love that phrase. And I want to maybe ask specifically in terms of the practice progress work, but also all the work that you do. What does good teaching or good facilitation look like when we're supporting white people in meeting the information about how racism and white supremacy work, how they show up? Because we know from all kinds of scholarship that white fragility is a real thing, and that meeting that information can sometimes result in disassociation, avoidance, denial, all kinds of things. And so what are you finding can help hold the space and meet the information in that very specific project?
Learning every day about it.
Yeah.
So I'll just do a tiny bit of information about practice progress and what Laurel's talking about. So practice progress is like a consulting, facilitation, professional development organization that uses body-based learning for anti-racist practice. We are focused on offering folks an experience of what does it mean to do this work, not only from, right, a very Western white supremacist framework of it being like an intellectual theory place, but that also and critically race and emotional experiences around race exist and live inside of our body systems, not only our intellectual systems. So Kai Hazelwood and I co-helm Practice Progress. And we, during the pandemic, right off the bat, right? Like all the information we were getting about the ways in which this virus is extremely salient in its way of fast tracking and like taking systematic oppression from its covert place and making it go so fast that we see it so starkly. And by we, I mean white people, right? Like we, I mean our communities who like don't have the lenses to see,
right,
something that is described to as from my experience as covert, but that is not
yeah,
the experience of people who are living it. So we were like, what are we gonna do? So we decided to we can't go and be in universities. We can't go and lead professional development in corporations right now. Like, let's create a public program where we're doing our work around affinity spaces and white working group spaces. So Kai holds a Black, Indigenous, and POC by POC circle that is like curricularly around and about what it means to be in community with those folks at this moment. And then I, at the same moment, have been holding a circle of white folks called a white working group. And we decided to call these circles both tandemly listen in. And so the practice of offering skill sets for the care of what it means to listen in, and also the like work for white people of what it means to listen in around racism. So, okay, that's a good little thing. So what are my tactics for inviting white folks into this work? I think I said one of them, which is the body. Right? I feel like for me, and this I learned from my training and my practice as a high school dance, site-specific dance creator with my young people, with my students, where we're going into our public spaces in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and learning about the histories of colonialism. And then they were doing that research in all these multifaceted ways, and then they were embodying that research through choreography that they were creating. So I just remember really clearly my student Hugo, who is Peace, he goes to Juilliard now. Hugo says, you know, I knew this stuff about New Mexico history, but now I know it. Now it's in me, right? So I bring that perspective to this work around engaging white folks in anti-racist theory. Like, if we're going to talk about white privilege, then my job as a facilitator has been to figure out how can I create a container. Also, I'll bring in another thing that I do, which is score making as a choreographer. How can I create a score that is open and closed enough for participants to enter where they're at around white privilege and do an embodied exercise. An example of that, I mean, we can do it right now. We did this on our first day in Listen, where I just asked folks to tap with their fingers places on their body where they feel a sense of power or welcomeness or safety or normalcy, right? These are all words that like exist in many different planes depending on who we are, but in the framework of white supremacy, like those ways are plugged into our dermal experience. So let's try. We're gonna tap on some places in our body where we might feel a sense of privilege.
Yeah.
I invite people who are watching to give this a try. And then like maybe what type of tap are you giving yourself, right? Like what is the, maybe try a different way. Like what's it like to give it a different type of pressure in those places that you've now identified as places where some of your power radiates from.
I remember the first time doing that exercise, I was so struck at the way in which I intellectualized it as step 2, which is the inversion of what usually is my dance training, which is to like absorb something cerebrally and cognitively and then transfer it into embodiment. And this was the opposite, where there was this like corporeal intuition to be like, oh, I'm just tapping my hair. I don't know why. And then I was like, I can articulate 7 reasons why my relationship to my hair has all of those characteristics of like white supremacist, like feeling safe, feeling powerful, all of that stuff is like really there. But the way in is through the body. And I think that I love so much the idea of scores as a framework for everything, but especially for like the body research that leads us into a self-reflexive anti-racist praxis, because inside of a score, there's no right answer, which is thing number 3 that we love about arts education. This is just like such an arts education PSA that like, it's not that conventional Western 5, 6, 7, 8 and hit it correctly, right? But inside of the score, we're using a set of tools and a delineated but mutable and flexible framework to discover a sort of way of inhabiting time and space and the body. And I think that so much of the discourse around white anti-racist work is like attempt and try and fail and feel uncomfortable about that and learn and try again. And that cycle of praxis feels related to score making because of that thing about the attempt, right? Like we're just trying. And that has come up a lot lately. It came up last night. I was on a Zoom call with a bunch of friends here in LA, and we were sort of like sharing, how are we showing up in this moment? And one of our friends was like, I don't know if I want to share because I don't think I have the right thing to say. And my sweet partner was like, just try. And like just that invitation felt really key.
That is another really important strategy. And I learned this from my own experience in this work, is that like the moments in which I felt invited into activism were the moments when someone was interested in asking me a question. And that like and that's just so true about humans, is that like we act from our hearts and from our value systems. And when those things are not acknowledged as what we're bringing to the table, we shut down. Mm-hmm. And so for me, like one of the ways that I leverage my Becky white girlness of being warm and approachable and a lot of white people aren't suspicious of me that I'm gonna have a hidden curriculum. But I just like, big words for me are invitation, like welcoming. The work is full of discomfort and pain and like reckoning, right? Yeah. I just feel like a huge part of my particular body and modality as a teacher is about, and a facilitator, and particularly of white folks that I'm welcoming into the mother father revolution of racial justice. I have to remember that like my job is to make space for people to bring where they're at and then invite them to find their growing edge. That's a term from urban bush women.
Yeah.
Right? To invite them to like come up against where they're at and then go a little farther, because we need you to do that immediately. Culture changes now. Yeah.
The education nerd in me, like I can't even help it, like wants to just like name things, like what you just said about like go to your growth edge and then go a little farther. Like in education theory, that's often called the zone of proximal development, where you get to know your students and you're like, here's what they can already do. Here's what they can probably do with a little bit of support. And the project of like continually expanding that. And I'm also thinking, more education nerd outs, I'm thinking about growth mindset, which I talked about in my intro to last week's call. The idea that white culture has stigmatized not knowing, that not knowing something should bring shame. That's a cultural construction, and that's something that we can undo in the classroom and in our relationships and in our families, but also in ourselves. And that is the work that to me feels super private and super internal and almost like cellular or genetic or something. Is, you know, I can donate money to organizations. I can post on the internet. I can do these. I can call my cousins and friends into the work. I can do these external things. But then there's this other thing where, like, at the end of the day, when it's just me and my body and, you know, the middle of the night, am I attending to that feeling inside myself that feels like not knowing something should have shame associated with it? And can I, like, what can I do? I'm like doing some embodied somatic thing to like move that energy around so it doesn't stagnate and get stuck, but so I can see it as energy that can transform. Because inside of a growth mindset, we want to believe that transformation is always possible, right? And as soon as we get stuck, that possibility also gets stuck.
Yeah.
You know?
I do know, and I think when I'm listening to you, I am reminded also of my desire to position performance as a learning site.
Mm-hmm.
And in my work with Ground Series Dance Collective, we like that whole process you just talked about, which is like in internal solar system relationship to our own work, but is inspired by and is also like in process of like turning out and into the world, which is helping us grow. That reminds me of a transformation that could happen in an audience member during a performance.
Yeah.
And that performance already is a time pre-COVID, and we're going to figure it out now in post-COVID too, when we're gathering, we're together, we all have agreed to put our attention on something. And so my job, hidden archive job as the choreographer, is to be like, great, here we are. What's the moment? How am I leveraging racial justice in this moment?
Yeah.
And can I not only use my abilities of as an artist, where that, like you're talking about, Laurel, where that dislodging and rearranging is made possible by composition and musicality and weight and empathetic experiences of watching another body experience something, right? Like the power of live dance and performance, that creates a cellular rearranging. And so then my work becomes, how can I also not just have this be the privilege of white people to make dances about the wind? How can I also bring in work for this audience member and for me as the performer and the learner inside of the research of making around contextualizing this moment as deeply racialized and we need to make change.
Yeah.
So I think about performance that way. I think about dance making that way. I think about what it means as an audience member to agree to open your heart. Okay, great. Thanks for opening your heart. Like, let's also open our hearts to a world where we are doing the work, the big work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that something that is coming up so intensely in so many different ways in this conversation and also like in this historical moment is the idea that if we don't return to the body as a way of knowing, like we're gonna stay lost. And I think, like, again, returning to the like innumerable list of why arts education is so important, when we facilitate spaces for the performing arts education, we're not necessarily trying to make the world's next most talented dancers. Maybe Hugo is in our class and maybe he ends up being one of the world's next most talented, but also we are trying to hold space for young people to come into a relationship to body as researcher, body as knowledge producer, and also like metabolizer of knowledge. And that like metabolic process that happens in the body of experiencing something, synthesizing it, and then making meaning out of it feels so crucial, especially right now when we know that, I mean, for fuck's sake, not to get into like a super analytical place, but like the number of think pieces, the number of data reports, the number of just the written information that we have available to us about, just to be specific, white supremacist state sanctioned violence is massive. And we're not seeing the shifts. And so physical bodies are going into the physical streets and occupying space as a different way of communicating, because a cerebral and linguistic way of communicating, while so valuable, is not sufficient. It's not enough. Right. And so I think that there's something, particularly because we're at this moment in history where like the like schism between the brain and the body, like here we are hanging out on like Zoom rooms all the time, is so vast that the need for embodiment is enormous, but also the need to do it really thoughtfully, and the need to sort of remember that also it's not enough just to stay in one's own little body and be like, oh, how do I feel? Mm-hmm. Right. And that is another tool that of yours that I want to really highlight that has been a fucking game changer for me recently, which is the idea of concentric circles and like making sure that I am engaged on all levels, or in all, you know, that I'm engaging with myself and just like hanging out internally. And that part of my engaging with myself is reading and absorbing knowledge from especially Black intellectuals and public intellectuals, people of color who I really respect. And then I move out from there and like, where is racism or white supremacy showing up in my family? Where is it showing up with my friends? Where is it showing up in the workplace? Where is it showing up in my larger community? And mapping that out has been a real, game changer. So I want to really thank you for that. And I wonder if you, as we kind of move into our last 7-ish minutes of holding space together, if you want to talk at all about that idea of like the layers or the ripples or the, you know.
Well, I just will share that when I lived in LA for 2 years, I was deeply under the tutelage of White People for Black Lives. And their modality has been to hold a Saturday dialogue where on Saturdays you like go do listen in work, where you are like, white people, go be messy together, right? Like it's a place to go do this thing that we're talking about of the internal practice and the internal work, which is critical and can't be missed, right? And then they also have an action-based space where like we are donating money every time we come into that room. We are signing up for what actions we are doing. We are on committees supporting Black Lives Matter, supporting Reform Jails LA, right? It's policy based and it's activism based. Yeah. Outwardly activism, big A.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that modality is critical, that both of those things have to happen at the same time. And I have teachers again and peers in my life. I want to shout out Adam McKinney of DNA Works. They always leverage their performance making, their teaching alongside ways that folks can be politically plugging into this work in their communities, with organizations. And that line doesn't need to be really firm, right? The art, learning, somatic, internal place, and the like, I'm ready to phone bank place, like we got to do this at the same overlapping moment.
Right.
So that offering, Laurel, of that I shared with Practice Progress, which is not a secret, but also like sign up for Practice Progress and I'll lead you through it. Is this practice of identifying where are, now that I am engaging in a deep process of sensing and listening to myself, and also I have a skill set where I can sense and listen to other people. Black people right now are letting us know what they need, and we need to be listening. So you got to slow your nervous system down to listen well and then respond, because there's some really clear directions.
Right.
So then that work of identifying, okay, I've got a really clear directive. Like for me, I have a really clear directive to go organize white people in the field of dance. That's been asked of me to do. And so I've got that. So then I make this sphere. Okay, how can I do that in my dance company? How can I do that with big national organizations in dance? How can I do that? It's like understanding where you stand and where your leverage points for action are is so critical, because it can feel really overwhelming to be like, oh God, the world is fucked. What do I do? Well, what you can do is engage in your sphere of influence.
And I think that the spheres also shift. I mean, and then the spheres also shift in relationship to time and the space-time continuum, in relationship to the body, in relationship to your own growth and development. Like the sphere isn't finite. And so that is like so crucial to name also, that like it's an ongoing, and there are some days where, 2 days ago, I was like feeling a feeling where I was like, I'm not going to post resources online for folks. I need to sit with myself and read some stuff, because I have to be accountable to myself right now. And then the next day I was like, I'm going to share 1,000 resources, and I'm going to donate a bunch of money, right? Like the energy can be internal, it can be external, but the multiplicity of ways to plug in, I think that rather than seeing it as an overwhelm, which can lead to paralysis, we can see it as a menu. And when you go to a restaurant, you look at the menu and you're like, what, kind of like mood am I in right now? And where can I engage with that thing? And then and that is body-based knowledge, right? To like see what is in my capacity today. Could I go into the streets for the BLM protest yesterday? No, I'm getting over being sick, but next week, like maybe fuck yeah. You know what I mean? So knowing where you're at and knowing that you can't plug into 1,000 things at one time, but you can plug into one thing. And then what does plugging in look like? And I think going back to the concentric circle diagram, another phrase that you use that I love is this idea of dumping out, which is kind of what this space that's held by White People for Black Lives looks like. That it's like, if we have messy feelings about that, let's engage in that with another white person or in a white space, so that folks of color don't have to hold any of that emotional labor. But then we can make reparations payments, which I think is another really beautiful operational justice thing that appears in Ground Series and in Practice Progress, that monies that are derived from that work are explicitly earmarked and directed as reparations. And I think that, maybe speaking of that, do we want to talk about where people can give tips today, going along with my restaurant metaphor, where if people want to donate and make a tip, if you enjoyed this conversation, there's links on the Zoom tube.
Yes. So, Black Visions Collective is an opportunity today. Again, like I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, but that's what's linked below. And they are an organization that is like deeply doing work around transformational justice and healing, led by Black folks in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities, doing work that is about sustainable transformation.
They actually have a really badass initiative that was launched today. That's a 4-point demand to defund the Minneapolis Police Department, because as an abolitionist organization, they would rather see resources get sucked out of that apparatus than just more carceral, punitive, cyclical phenomena. So that's one place that donations could go, is towards this initiative to defund the Minneapolis PD.
I just think that when we are able to connect the constellation dots of our histories, our present day moments, our embodied realities, our embodied metaphors and symbologies, that's when work happens. And I say that so much work, but what I mean by that is that we're like engaging with the nebulous system that has been like purposefully created as a cloud by the architects of colonialism. That when we like work on this project of like clearing it the fuck up, we do that from a place of self-awareness, of knowing inside. That's when we build a world based on, and I am able to like ground down in relationships and actions and change based on trust and genuine connection, as opposed to a performativity of doing. That instead of performing doing, I'm actually emotionally, spiritually, psychically altering and creating connection.
Yeah. And I think that is the biggest gift that I've taken away from working with you is developing a somatic baseline in my body, which ultimately our body is the only location we have of knowing. Yep. As you know what I mean, people on planet Earth. That's like the only fundamental shared experience we have, is like bodies and space and time. And to have that somatic baseline of what it feels like to be in integrity, to be in alignment, right? To be moving from that place of accountability and synthesis that's not about performativity or any number of other things that could be kind of like out of alignment. That is a huge gift, because it's like the ringing of a bell. And like this process, it's not permanent, or like the ringing of an actual bell. It's not permanent. Nothing is permanent. But the beauty of praxis is we just return to it. And so the idea that one of the things we can do, and there's so much paradox to this work. We got to work now, urgently. This problem been urgent. At the same time, we have to work really slowly and deliberately so that we are moving at the speed of trust, which is Adrienne Marie Brown emergent strategy. And so to like have praxis as a cycle of that, of like accelerate, decelerate, return, and make sure that you're working from integrity is a real gift that I think you have to offer. So people can find you at wepracticeprogress.org.
We're like practiceprogress.org. No, practiceprogress.org. But on our Instagram, on our Facebook, we're at We Practice Progress.
Great.
We want to come work with you. We want to come, do this work with white people. We want to come do this work with folks of color. We want to come do this work in institutions. We want to do this work in your book group. We want to do this work with you. And so, Practice Progress, please. And then Ground Series, Dance Collective, we make work and we lead programming around, particularly right now, around colonialism and the weaponized white woman on stage, right? So like, we're excited to keep inviting you in.
Yeah, thank you. All of those links are down below in the YouTube, Zoom tube. I hope that everybody engages with it. And I'm just so grateful for this conversation. I mean, there's like a whole other conversation we can have about all of the adventures that we've had in water parks and road trips and dancing and fireworks and doing this work to get to the revolution means that we're working towards a future where that can be what we do all the time, but we got to do the hard stuff first. I love you. I'm so grateful for this conversation.
I love you so much. Thank you for holding up in this moment. Y'all watch the rest of these brilliant people who are going to be on this talk show, because this work of who are our channels, who are our teachers, who are our facilitators, that's like, those are that's what I did earlier, right? They're like doing cosmic work. So just thank you, Laurel, for making this space, and thank you for connecting us in this time when we're apart. It's so beautiful to be with you and to be with all the people who are watching. Thank you for watching.
Yeah, thank you, people of the internet. Thank you, Sarah.